The shelter smelled like industrial disinfectant and defeat. Not the clean, sharp scent that suggested care, but the thick, cloying odor of chemicals applied to mask what couldn't be properly cleaned. Chen sat on the edge of a cot that sagged under minimal weight, watching her daughter Lily sleep in the dim light filtering through windows set too high to offer any view beyond gray sky. Lily was 8 years old and hadn't spoken in 14 months. Not since the accident. Not since the day their car had been struck by a drunk driver on a Tuesday afternoon, killing Sarah's husband instantly and leaving Lily with injuries that healed everywhere except in the place where words lived. The doctors had explanations: trauma, selective mutism, psychological protection. Sarah had heard them all. None of them brought her daughter's voice back. The shelter allowed them 7 days. 7 days to find work, housing, stability. Then they would need to leave, make room for the next family whose circumstances had collapsed faster than they could rebuild. Sarah had tried. God, she had tried. Applications submitted to 63 jobs in the past month. Retail positions, cleaning services, data entry. Anything that didn't require credentials she no longer possessed or references from an employer who'd let her go when grief made her unreliable. The responses were formulaic when they came at all. We appreciate your interest, but unfortunately, at this time, we've decided to pursue other candidates. Each rejection landed with the dull weight of inevitability, confirming what she already knew. The world had no space for a woman with gaps in her employment history, no permanent address, and a child who required patience that minimum wage managers couldn't afford to provide. Her phone, a prepaid model she recharged at the public library, showed 3% battery and $6 remaining on her card. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Food for tomorrow would cost $8 if she stretched it properly. Bus fare to reach the interview she'd secured for Thursday required another $4.50. The battery charger she needed had broken 2 weeks ago, and replacement wasn't something she could prioritize when Lily needed shoes that didn't pinch her growing feet. Lily stirred in her sleep, her face relaxing into an expression that reminded Sarah of easier times. Times when her daughter's silence had been the comfortable quiet of a child absorbed in drawing, not the oppressive absence that now defined their existence. Lily communicated through gestures, through drawings scratched into notebooks salvaged from donation bins, through expressions that Sarah had learned to read with the desperate precision of someone who couldn't afford to misunderstand. The shelter's lights hummed with a frequency that made Sarah's teeth ache. Around them, other families navigated the same compressed space with practiced avoidance. Eyes didn't meet. Conversations were kept low. Privacy was a fiction everyone pretended to maintain because the alternative, acknowledging how completely their boundaries had dissolved, was too painful to bear. A woman 2 cots overcoughed with a wet, persistent sound of someone who needed medical attention she couldn't access. Her children, 3 of them ranging from 4 to maybe 10, sat unusually still, trained by circumstances to take up as little space as possible. Sarah recognized the look. She saw it in mirrors when she allowed herself to look. The expression of someone managing catastrophe in real time, making calculations about which disaster to address first when all of them demanded immediate attention. The envelope arrived through a mechanism Sarah didn't fully understand. The shelter's administrative office called her name during morning assembly, handing her a single piece of mail forwarded through a chain of addresses that stretched back to the apartment she'd lost 4 months earlier. The envelope was heavy, formal, bearing the letterhead of a law firm whose name carried weight Sarah could recognize even through her exhaustion. She opened it standing in the hallway, where morning light entered through frosted glass, aware that Lily was watching from the doorway with the intense focus she brought to everything now that words had been taken from her. The letter inside unfolded into multiple pages, legal language arranged in dense paragraphs that Sarah had to read 3 times before the meaning penetrated her fatigue. Estate notification, inheritance, property transfer. The phrases felt unreal, assembled from elements that belonged in someone else's story. Her grandmother, Chen, had died. The information landed without the impact it should have carried. Sarah's relationship with her grandmother had been maintained through sporadic phone calls and holiday cards. Contacts stretched thin by distance and the demands of separate lives. May had been 86. Living alone in a city Sarah had visited exactly twice in her entire life, both times as a child when details had mattered less than the adventure of travel itself. But it was the next section that stopped Sarah's breath entirely. May had owned property, a structure purchased decades earlier through circumstances the letter didn't explain. The property had been listed in estate records that had only recently been fully processed. As May's sole surviving heir, Sarah's father having died 6 years earlier, everything passed to Sarah by default. The property was located in the industrial waterfront district of a mid-sized river city 300 miles north. It was described in the legal documentation as a decommissioned vessel structure with significant historical and architectural features. The language was deliberately vague, offering no clear picture of what exactly Sarah had inherited. But attached to the letter was a bill of sale from 1989, yellowed and creased, showing that May Chen had purchased something called the Empress Opera Barge for $600 at a municipal auction. $600. The amount felt simultaneously impossible and tragically plausible. Sarah knew the shape of desperation that drove people to spend their last resources on something that looked like opportunity. Her grandmother had been an immigrant, arriving from Taiwan in 1972 with limited English and fewer prospects. She'd worked in restaurant kitchens, garment factories, and eventually as a seamstress, building a life through labor that destroyed her hands but kept her independent. The idea that she'd spent $600 on what municipal records called a sunken barge in need of immediate salvage or demolition suggested either profound foolishness or desperate hope. The letter continued with details that clarified nothing. The property had been listed as uninhabitable for tax purposes since purchase. Municipal liens had accumulated over decades, though apparently not enough to trigger forced sale. Current status: abandoned, partially submerged, located in a section of waterfront scheduled for eventual development, but perpetually delayed due to contamination concerns and access difficulties. Sarah looked up from a letter to find Lily standing close, her dark eyes scanning the pages with the intensity that had replaced verbal questions. Sarah crouched to her daughter's level, smoothing hair that hadn't been properly washed in 3 days because the shelter shower schedule couldn't accommodate everyone's needs. "Grandma May left us something," Sarah said quietly, shaping the words carefully because Lily read lips with the focus of someone who'd been forced to learn. "A boat. A big boat that's been sitting in a river for a long time." Lily's expression shifted through questions Sarah could read without words. "Where? What kind? Can we see it? It's 300 miles from here. I don't know what kind. And I don't know if we can see it because I don't know how we get there." Lily pulled out the small notebook she carried everywhere now, the pages filled with drawings that served as her voice. She sketched quickly, a simple boat shape, a stick figure of herself and Sarah standing beside it, a house with a roof drawn in careful lines. She pointed to the house, then to the boat, then to Sarah with an expression that needed no translation. "Can we live there?" The question gutted Sarah in ways she couldn't articulate. Her 8-year-old daughter, who'd lost her father and her voice and every stability she'd once known, was asking whether an abandoned barge that had been decaying for 35 years might be home. The optimism felt cruel in its impossibility. But beneath Lily's question lay something else, a recognition that they were out of options, that even impossible chances deserved consideration when the alternative was accepting that no chances remained. That evening, Sarah used the shelter's computer during the 15-minute window allotted to each resident. She searched for information about the Empress Opera Barge, finding fragments scattered across historical archives and city planning documents that painted an incomplete picture. The barge had been built in 1923, one of several floating entertainment venues that serviced river cities during an era when waterways served as primary transportation corridors. It wasn't a traditional boat meant for travel, but a permanently moored structure that happened to float, essentially a building on a barge platform. The Empress had hosted opera performances, theatrical productions, and later jazz concerts, serving as a cultural anchor for communities that lacked permanent theaters. By the 1950s, changing entertainment preferences and the rise of automobile culture had made such venues obsolete. The Empress had been sold, converted into a floating restaurant, then sold again when that venture failed. By 1989, when May purchased it, the Barge had been sitting partially submerged for at least a decade, its mooring lines severed, its structure slowly yielding to water damage and neglect. Photographs from the 1920s showed an ornate vessel, its exterior decorated with carved details and paint that suggested opulence. The main performance space had featured seating for 200, a stage with elaborate curtain systems, and acoustics designed by engineers who understood how sound traveled in enclosed spaces. Later photographs from the 1980s showed decay, broken windows, collapsed sections of roof, listing angles that suggested the hull beneath had been compromised. Sarah found one article from a local newspaper dated 1990, a small piece about failed revitalization efforts. It mentioned Chen as one of several individuals who'd purchased abandoned waterfront properties hoping to capitalize on development promises that never materialized. The article's tone was dismissive, treating these buyers as naive or foolish, their investments certain to yield nothing but wasted money and eventual surrender to municipal demolition orders. But demolition had never come. The Barge still appeared on current property maps, still listed under May's name in estate records, still technically Sarah's responsibility regardless of whether it held any value beyond the cost of properly disposing of it. The computer screen's light felt harsh against Sarah's eyes, exhaustion making it difficult to focus on the dense text of municipal codes and property regulations. She learned that claiming the inheritance required appearing in person, that transfer couldn't be completed remotely, that someone needed to physically assess the property before estate closure could proceed. 300 miles. The distance felt insurmountable when she calculated costs. Bus tickets for two would consume money she didn't have. The trip would require overnight accommodation, food, time away from the job search that was already producing nothing but rejection. Every practical consideration argued against going. But Sarah kept returning to Lily's drawing. The simple boat shape, the hopeful house with its carefully drawn roof. Her daughter, who'd stopped speaking because trauma had made words feel impossible, had found hope in an abandoned barge she'd never seen. That hope felt sacred in ways Sarah couldn't dismiss, even when logic demanded it. The decision formed slowly, accumulating through the night while Lily slept and Sarah lay awake listening to the shelter's sounds. Coughs, whispered conversations, the crying of a baby 3 rows over whose mother tried desperately to provide comfort in circumstances that offered none. By morning, the decision had solidified not through confidence, but through the recognition that staying still guaranteed nothing except more of what they already had. She would take Lily north to see the barge. Not because it represented realistic salvation, but because sometimes the act of moving towards something, even something improbable, mattered more than the certainty of outcome. Because her daughter had asked without words whether they might have a home, and Sarah refused to answer that question with surrender. The shelter director listened to Sarah's explanation with the exhausted patience of someone who'd heard countless stories of complicated situations. Sarah kept it simple. Family property, inheritance requiring in-person assessment, temporary departure with intent to return. She didn't mention that return felt increasingly unlikely, that she was essentially abandoning her spot in the shelter on the possibility that something abandoned 35 years ago might offer what nothing else had. The director nodded slowly. You understand that leaving means giving up your bed. We can't hold spaces when demand exceeds capacity. I understand. And if the property situation doesn't work out, you'll be starting over in the queue. Could be weeks before we have another opening. Understand, Sarah repeated, though understanding didn't make the risk feel smaller. The director studied her with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been resignation. Sometimes people need to chase possibilities even when they look thin. Just make sure you're protecting your daughter in the chasing. Sarah spent their last day at the shelter organizing what little they owned into categories: necessary, valuable, and disposable. Necessary fit into 2 backpacks. Clothes that still fit Lily, Sarah's single interview outfit. Documents too important to lose, and the medications Lily needed for headaches that still came frequently. Valuable meant Lily's notebooks, the drawings that served as her voice, and a photograph of her father that Lily kept wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from damage. Everything else, worn clothing, broken electronics, paperback books from donation bins, Sarah left behind for whoever needed them next. They walked to the bus station through morning streets where early commuters moved with the purposeful stride of people whose destinations were certain. Sarah's stride felt different, determined but fragile, propelled by desperation disguised as hope. Lily held her hand tightly, the pressure communicating what words couldn't. Trust, fear, readiness for whatever came next. The bus tickets consumed $48, leaving Sarah with $32 between them and complete destitution. She calculated expenses with the precision of someone who'd learned that miscalculation meant missing meals. Food for the journey. $10 if they rationed carefully. One night's accommodation at the cheapest motel she could find online. $35, which meant they'd arrive functionally broke. She pushed the calculation aside, refusing to let mathematics stop movement that had already begun. The bus departed at 10:15, heading north through landscapes that shifted gradually from urban density to industrial sprawl to something approaching rural emptiness. Lily sat pressed against the window, watching the world pass with the focused attention she brought to everything now. Sarah wondered what her daughter saw in the passing scenery. Possibility, or just more evidence that the world was larger than they could control. They rode for 6 hours, stopping briefly at terminals that smelled like diesel exhaust and stale food. Sarah bought crackers and fruit that had been sitting under heat lamps too long, portioning it carefully to make it last. Lily ate without complaint, the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned that food was fuel rather than pleasure. The river city appeared gradually through bus windows. First the outskirts marked by warehouse districts and industrial parks, then older neighborhoods where brick buildings bore faded advertisement for products no one manufactured anymore. The downtown core showed signs of revitalization attempts. New restaurants beside empty storefronts, renovated loft. Buildings towering over parking lots waiting for development. It was a city in transition, caught between what it had been and what it hoped to become, success and failure existing side by side. The bus station occupied a squat concrete building that looked like it had been designed to survive rather than impress. Sarah and Lily disembarked into late afternoon light that felt thin and uncertain. The air carried the mineral scent of the river, mixed with industrial odors Sarah couldn't identify, chemicals, rust, something organic gone wrong. She had an address, but no clear sense of how to reach it. The waterfront district where the barge was supposedly located wasn't served by the sparse public transit system. A taxi would cost money they didn't have. Walking would require navigation through areas that looked increasingly questionable as Sarah consulted the map on her dying phone. They walked 40 minutes through neighborhoods that deteriorated with each block, the architecture shifting from maintained to neglected to actively crumbling. Businesses gave way to empty buildings with windows covered by plywood marked with spray-painted warnings. The sidewalks cracked and heaved, tree roots having long since won the battle against concrete. Other pedestrians were sparse, moving with the cautious speed of people who understood that visibility sometimes attracted problems. Lily stayed close, her hand gripping Sarah's with pressure that increased each time they passed someone whose attention lingered too long. Sarah maintained steady pace, projecting confidence she didn't feel, knowing that hesitation could be interpreted as vulnerability. The waterfront appeared suddenly, the street dead-ending at a chain-link fence that separated urban land from industrial water access. Beyond the fence, Sarah could see the river, wide, brown, moving with deceptive calm. Barges and cargo vessels sat at distant docks, their outlines softened by the haze that hung over water. Closer, along the fence line, she saw what looked like abandoned maritime structures. Old warehouses, collapsed piers, rusted equipment left to decay because removal cost more than allowing nature to reclaim it. The property address corresponded to a section of fence where the chain link had been cut and peeled back, creating an opening wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Posted signs warned about trespassing, environmental hazards, and structural instability in language meant to discourage curiosity. Sarah hesitated at the opening, looking at Lily, whose expression asked the question Sarah was already asking herself. Are we really doing this? Sarah crouched to Lily's level, making eye contact in a way that had become their primary communication. This might not be safe. The building might be falling apart. If I tell you to run, you run. You understand? Lily nodded once, the gesture carrying absolute commitment. They squeezed through the fence gap, emerging into a wasteland of industrial debris and invasive vegetation. The ground was uneven, rutted with tire tracks from vehicles that had long since abandoned this access. Rusted metal protruded from earth at random intervals. Rebar, pipe sections, fragments of machinery whose original purpose had been lost to corrosion. Sarah moved carefully, testing each step, aware that broken glass and sharp metal waited beneath the overgrown grass. The river's smell grew stronger, not unpleasant exactly, but organic and overwhelming, the scent of water that had absorbed decades of urban runoff and industrial discharge. They walked perhaps 200 yards along a path that was barely distinguishable from the surrounding wasteland. Then the vegetation thinned, and Sarah saw it. The Empress Opera barge sat at a 45-degree angle in shallow water, its stern section partially submerged, its bow elevated as if the vessel were perpetually climbing toward air it couldn't quite reach. The structure was massive, larger than any boat Sarah had imagined, more like a building that happened to be floating than anything designed for water travel. What remained of the exterior showed bones of former grandeur. Ornate carved details still clung to the bow section. The weather had stripped most of the paint away, leaving bare wood that had turned silver gray with age. Windows, most broken or missing entirely, punctuated the upper level in a rhythm that suggested careful design. The roof had collapsed in several places, creating gaps that exposed the interior to weather and birds. But it was still standing, still floating, however precariously, still recognizable as the structure it had been built to be, despite 3 decades of abandonment and a municipal designation that treated it as garbage waiting for removal. Lily pulled at Sarah's sleeve, pointing. Sarah followed her daughter's gesture and understood what had caught her attention. Despite the decay, despite the obvious damage, lights were visible through some of the intact windows. Not bright illumination, but the faint glow that suggested candles or battery-powered lanterns. Someone was inside. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, caught between relief that the structure wasn't completely dead and fear about who might have claimed it as shelter. Homeless encampments, drug operations, squatters who wouldn't welcome strangers. The possibilities multiplied quickly, each one suggesting danger. She was about to suggest retreat when a figure emerged from a door on the upper deck. A woman, maybe 60 years old, wearing layers that suggested she'd learned to adapt to temperature fluctuations. She moved with the careful precision of someone managing arthritis or old injuries, descending an external staircase one deliberate step at a time. When she reached the boarding ramp, a collection of pallets and plywood that bridged the gap between shore and barge, she stopped and looked directly at Sarah and Lily. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was assessing, measuring them against some criteria Sarah couldn't guess. If you're here to condemn it, I've got paperwork says you can't. Her voice carried clearly across the distance, shaped by years of cigarettes and shouting. If you're here to squat, I was here first, and I'm not sharing. And if you're here because you're lost, nearest bus stop is that way. She gestured vaguely toward the city. Sarah stepped forward carefully, Lily shadowing her movements. I'm Sarah Chen. This barge belonged to my grandmother, May Chen. She passed away 3 weeks ago. The woman's expression shifted through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been recognition. She studied Sarah with renewed intensity, looking for resemblance to someone she'd apparently known. May Chen. Christ, I haven't heard that name in 15 years. She descended the rest of the ramp, approaching with movements that remained cautious despite verbal acknowledgement. She owned this place, bought it in 1989. According to the estate paperwork, she never sold it. She never visited it either. At least not that I saw, and I've been here 6 years. The woman stopped a few paces away, still evaluating. Name's Gloria. I've been living here because nobody else wanted to, and the city was too busy to notice. If you're here to evict me, let's skip the dance. I've got nowhere else to go. Sarah felt the weight of that statement, recognizing the naked vulnerability in Gloria's defiance. Here was someone else who'd reached the end of options, who'd claimed shelter in an abandoned ruin, because even that was better than nothing. I'm not here to evict you. I'm here because I inherited this, and I don't know what I inherited. I need to see inside. Gloria's posture relaxed slightly. She looked at Lily, noting the girl's silence and the way she pressed close to Sarah. The kid doesn't talk. Not anymore. Gloria nodded once, the gesture carrying understanding that didn't require explanation. All right, come on then. Watch your step. The boarding ramp's stable enough if you're careful, but the interior's a goddamn obstacle course. Holes in floors, stairs that end in empty air, sections where the ceiling's trying to become the floor. You break something, it's your own fault. She turned and headed back toward the ramp, not waiting to see if they followed. Sarah exchanged a glance with Lily, finding determination in her daughter's expression that matched her own. They moved forward together, crossing from solid ground to the uncertain platform that bridged the gap to the barge. The wood creaked under their weight, but held. Water lapped gently against the hull beneath them, the sound almost peaceful if Sarah ignored the instability it represented. They climbed toward the door Gloria had used, entering the dimness of a structure that had spent 35 years waiting for someone to remember existed. The interior took Sarah's breath, not with beauty, but with the sheer scale of what May had purchased for $600. They stood in what Gloria called the lobby level, though the term barely captured the space's original grandeur. The ceiling rose 15 feet overhead, though portions had collapsed, allowing afternoon light to stream through gaps in irregular patterns. Ornate plasterwork still clung to the walls and sections, showing evidence of designs that had once been painted in colors Sarah could only guess at. Now everything wore the monochrome of age, grays, browns, the particular shade of decay that came from water damage and neglect. The floor sloped noticeably toward the stern, following the barge's listing angle. Standing required constant minor adjustments to maintain balance, creating a disorienting sensation of movement even when everything remained still. Sarah noticed how Gloria walked, a rolling gait that accommodated the slope without conscious thought. Muscle memory developed over years of adaptation. She really bought this? Sarah's voice echoed strangely in the cavernous space. For $600? City was desperate to offload it, Gloria replied, moving toward an interior staircase with confidence born from familiarity. Demolition would have cost tens of thousands, and they kept hoping someone would pay to restore it. Your grandmother probably figured she was getting a deal. Hell, maybe she was. Depends on what she planned to do with it. They climbed stairs that groaned protest but held, ascending to what Gloria identified as the performance level. Here the scope of the Empress's original purpose became unmistakable. The main chamber opened before them, vast and damaged, and still somehow magnificent in its bones. Rows of seating remained bolted to the sloped floor, their upholstery long since destroyed by water and animals, but their metal frames intact. The stage occupied the elevated bow section, its wooden surface warped but complete. Above, the ceiling showed evidence of elaborate architectural features. Beams carved with decorative details, the remains of what might have been chandelier fixtures, acoustic panels designed to distribute sound evenly through the space. Lily moved forward without waiting for permission, drawn by the space's improbable survival. She climbed onto the stage, turned to face the empty seating, and stood with arms spread slightly, as if testing how it felt to occupy that position. Sarah watched her daughter claim the stage with a mixture of heartbreak and hope. Lily, who'd lost her voice, standing in a space designed for voices to be amplified and celebrated. Gloria spoke quietly from beside Sarah. First time I came in here, I thought I was hallucinating. You don't expect to find something like this sitting in a river forgotten. It's wrong somehow. Something this size should have been noticed, salvaged, or destroyed. Instead, it's just existing. Waiting. Waiting for what? Damned if I know. For someone to decide what it's worth, maybe. Sarah moved deeper into the performance chamber, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She tried to imagine what this place had been at its peak. Gas lights or early electricity illuminating polished wood and painted walls, audiences dressed in their best clothing filling the seats, performers commanding attention from the stage. The contrast between that imagined past and the ruined present felt almost violent in its totality. But beneath the decay, Sarah sensed something else. Structure. The walls, though damaged, remained fundamentally sound. The roof, though collapsed in sections, still covered most of the interior. The floor sloped but didn't buckle. This wasn't a building on the verge of collapse. It was a building that had survived decades of neglect and remained stubbornly intact, refusing to yield to water and time as easily as it should have. How long has it been like this? Sarah asked. Partially sunk, Gloria shrugged. Since before I got here. Maybe since your grandmother bought it. Maybe longer. The stern section took on water at some point. Hull breach, failed pumping system, something. City should have dealt with it then, but they didn't. So it settled at this angle and just stayed. The water line stable. Not sinking further, not rising. Just frozen in this half-drowned state. They continued the tour, Gloria leading them through passages and chambers that revealed the barge's original complexity. Below the performance level were storage areas, former dressing rooms, and what appeared to have been a kitchen facility large enough to serve hundreds. Most of these lower spaces were heavily damaged, the sloped floors having channeled water into pools that had fostered rot and mold. But even here, Sarah noticed patterns. Certain sections had been cleared, debris removed, and makeshift repairs implemented. Gloria's work, the older woman explained, 6 years of making the space minimally habitable, at least in the areas she occupied. I've been living in what used to be the manager's office, Gloria said, leading them to a small chamber on the upper level. It's dry, relatively stable, and the window still is glass. Everything I need. The space was spare but organized. A camping cot, neatly made. Plastic containers stacked along one wall holding food and supplies. A camp stove for cooking. Battery-powered lanterns providing light. It was poverty made functional, the arrangement of someone who'd learned to survive with limited resources and no safety net. Lily approached Gloria's space with respectful curiosity, not touching anything, but examining how Gloria had organized her existence within the barge's ruins. Sarah saw her daughter absorbing lessons about adaptation, about making do, about claiming dignity in circumstances that offered little. They returned to the performance chamber as afternoon light began shifting toward evening. The light entering through roof gaps took on golden qualities that briefly transformed the decay into something approaching beauty. Sarah stood at the stage's edge, looking out at the empty seating, trying to understand what her grandmother had seen when she'd spent $600 on an abandoned barge. Did you know May? Sarah asked Gloria. Did she ever come here? Never met her. But about 3 years ago, I found something that suggested she'd been here at least once. Gloria disappeared briefly, returning with a metal box, rusted but intact. She opened it to reveal contents protected from moisture. Papers carefully folded. Found this hidden in a wall panel I was repairing. Thought maybe it was worth something. Turns out it was just personal stuff. She handed the box to Sarah, who lifted the papers with careful hands. They were letters, written in Mandarin, dated across several years in the 1990s. Sarah couldn't read the characters, but she recognized her grandmother's handwriting from birthday cards. Mixed among the letters were photographs. May as a younger woman, standing in front of what Sarah now recognized as the Empress. The barge looked different in the photos, less damaged, though still clearly abandoned. In one image, May stood on the stage, her expression serious, purposeful. The final item in the box stopped Sarah's breath. A key, old and heavy, attached to a handwritten label in English, "Stage Vault. Remember the pattern." Sarah held the key up to the fading light. "Did you know there was a vault under the stage?" Gloria's expression shifted to surprise. "I knew there were storage spaces under there. Never found a way to access them. The whole stage section is elevated off the floor structure, hollow underneath. I figured whatever was down there had been cleaned out decades ago." "You're saying there's an actual vault?" "That's what this label says." Sarah turned to look at the stage where Lily still stood, silhouetted against the window light. "My grandmother left a key to something under there, and instructions about a pattern." The three of them stood in the dimming chamber, looking at the stage that had once held performers and now held a silent 8-year-old girl searching for meaning in a space designed for art. Somewhere beneath that stage, protected by a locked vault and May's cryptic reference to a pattern, lay something her grandmother had considered important enough to hide and document. Sarah felt the weight of the key in her palm, understanding that this discovery changed everything. This wasn't just an abandoned barge waiting for demolition. This was a structure that had held secrets, that had been deliberately secured, that her grandmother had visited and protected even when practical considerations suggested abandoning it entirely. "We need to open that vault," Sarah said quietly. Gloria nodded slowly. Yeah, we do. But it'll have to wait until morning. Light's going fast, and you don't want to be crawling around under that stage in the dark. Too many ways to get hurt." She wasn't wrong. Sarah could already feel exhaustion pressing against her bones, the weight of the day's travel and tension, and the surreal experience of standing inside a structure that shouldn't still exist. Lily had climbed down from the stage and moved to Sarah's side, her expression asking questions that would require more than simple gestures to answer. "Is there room for us to stay tonight?" Sarah asked Gloria. "I need to figure out what we're dealing with before we make any decisions about next steps." Gloria studied them both with an expression that mixed wariness with something approaching sympathy. "The dressing room next to my space is dry and mostly intact. No furniture, but the floor's solid. You got sleeping bags?" "No." Sarah felt the familiar shame of admitting how completely unprepared they were. "We left the shelter with what we could carry. Didn't have room for camping gear." Gloria was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I've got extra blankets. They're not much, but they're better than bare floor. You'll be safe here. Nobody comes around anymore except city inspectors twice a year, and they just check if it's still floating. They never come inside." Sarah accepted the offer with gratitude that felt too large to articulate properly. She followed Gloria to the dressing room, which proved to be exactly as described: dry, empty, and stable enough to feel secure. Gloria brought blankets that smelled of storage, but were clean enough, along with 2 bottles of water and granola bars from her own supplies. "Payment," Gloria said when Sarah tried to refuse. "For letting me stay without hassle. Fair trade." After Gloria left, Sarah arranged the blankets in a makeshift beds while Lily explored the small space with methodical attention. The girl found what she was looking for quickly: a section of wall where the paint had faded enough to create a pale surface. She pulled out her notebook, selected a pencil, and began drawing directly on the wall. Sarah watched her daughter work without interrupting. Lily drew the stage, rendered with careful detail that captured the empty seating and the damaged ceiling and the quality of light that had made everything look almost beautiful for a few moments. She drew the key, enlarged and detailed. Then she drew figures, Sarah and herself, standing on the stage together, looking down at something beneath the elevated platform. Sarah understood the drawing's message. Tomorrow they would open the vault. Tomorrow they would discover what May had hidden beneath a stage that had once amplified voices and now held only silence. Whatever they found would determine what came next, whether this abandoned barge represented salvation or just another form of disappointment. She settled beside Lily on the makeshift bed, wrapping her daughter in blankets that smelled like someone else's survival. Through broken windows, she could hear the river moving past, patient and indifferent. Above them, the damaged ceiling revealed a section of night sky where stars were beginning to appear, sharp and distant. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. The accident, the silence, the shelter, the desperate walk through an unfamiliar city toward a structure that existed only because no one had cared enough to destroy it. She thought about May, her grandmother, who'd spent $600 on an abandoned dream and apparently never stopped believing it might matter. Tomorrow, Sarah whispered to Lily, knowing her daughter could read her lips even in dim light. Tomorrow we find out what Grandma, May wanted us to see. Lily nodded once, the gesture carrying exhaustion and hope in equal measure. They lay down together in the darkness of a dressing room that had once held performers preparing to claim an audience's attention. Now it held two people who'd run out of options, betting everything on the possibility that abandonment sometimes concealed value that simply needed the right person to recognize it. The river continued its movement beneath them, rocking the barge with gentle persistence. The motion should have been unsettling, but instead it felt almost comforting, proof that even structures listing at impossible angles could maintain equilibrium if their foundations held. Sarah closed her eyes and let the rocking motion carry her towards sleep, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, the key to the stage vault pressed between her palm and the blanket. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow they would discover whether May's secret justified the journey, the risk, the choice to trade certainty for possibility. For tonight, it was enough to have shelter, however precarious. Enough to lie beside her daughter in a space that had once celebrated voices, even though Lily's voice remained lost somewhere words couldn't reach. Enough to hold a key that promised something hidden beneath decay, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions and look in the right places. The darkness settled completely, broken only by the faint stars visible through gaps in the damaged structure above. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythms, traffic, voices, the industrial hum of a working waterfront. But inside the Empress Opera barge, silence reigned, the kind that came from a space designed for sound that had forgotten how to produce it. Tomorrow would test whether silence could be broken, whether what lay hidden could justify hope, whether a grandmother's $600 gamble on an abandoned dream might save two people who'd already lost everything else. The river knew no answer. It simply continued its ancient movement, carrying water toward destinations it would reach with or without human understanding of what any of it meant. Morning arrived through broken windows with the particular quality of light that belonged to water, reflected, diffused, constantly moving. Sarah woke to the sound of the river lapping against the hull and the sharp cry of gulls fighting over something near the shore. Her body ached from sleeping on hard floor despite the blankets, muscles protesting the accommodation in ways that reminded her how far she'd fallen from the life where mattresses and pillows had been assumed rather than luxuries. Lily was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the window with her notebook open, drawing the morning light's patterns as they shifted across the damaged walls. The girl's hair needed washing, her clothes needed replacing, but her focus remained absolute, documenting everything, translating experience into images because words had been taken from her. Gloria appeared in the doorway holding 3 tin cups of instant coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air. Figured you'd want something warm before we start digging around under that stage. It's not good coffee, but it's hot and it's caffeinated. Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. The coffee tasted like chemicals and disappointment, but Gloria was right. It was hot, and the caffeine hit her system with the urgency of someone who hadn't slept properly in months. Lily declined her cup with a polite shake of her head, returning to her drawing with single-minded focus. "I've been thinking about that vault," Gloria said, settling against the doorframe with her own coffee. "If your grandmother went to the trouble of hiding a key and writing cryptic instructions about patterns, whatever's down there mattered to her. Question is whether it still matters now, or whether 35 years turned it into garbage." Sarah pulled the key from her pocket, examining it in better light. It was old, heavy, the kind of mechanism that predated modern lock technology. The metal had oxidized, but not rusted completely, suggesting it had been kept dry despite the barge's constant moisture. The label attached to it had been written in May's careful hand. Stage vault. Remember the pattern. What pattern? Sarah voiced the question that had kept her half awake through the night. Pattern of what? The key itself? Something about the lock? Or something else entirely? Gloria shrugged. Only one way to find out. Come on, let's see what we're dealing with before the day gets too hot. Summer in a metal structure, sitting in water, gets brutal by noon. They made their way to the performance chamber, which looked different in morning light. Less romantic, more damaged. The decay that evening shadows had softened was stark and undeniable under direct illumination. Water stains tracked down walls in patterns that suggested repeated flooding. Sections of floor had rotted through completely, creating gaps that revealed the structure beneath. The seating that had looked merely worn in twilight now showed advanced deterioration, metal frames corroded to the point of fragility. But the stage remained solid. Whatever materials had been used in its construction had resisted water and time more successfully than the surrounding structure. The elevated platform stood approximately 4 feet above the sloped floor level, creating a hollow space beneath that Gloria had correctly identified but never accessed. Sarah climbed onto the stage, Lily following close behind. The wood surface was warped and discolored but structurally sound, producing only minor creaks under their weight. She moved to the center, looking for any obvious access point. A trapdoor, a removable panel, some indication of how to reach the space below. There was nothing. The stage surface appeared continuous. Individual boards fitted so tightly that seams were barely visible. No hinges, no handles, no interruption in the pattern. It's underneath, Gloria called from floor level. Access has to be from below, not above. Sarah descended and moved to examine the stage's understructure. The elevated platform was supported by a framework of heavy beams arranged in a grid pattern, creating compartmented spaces between them. Most of these spaces were shallow, clearly visible, and empty except for the debris that had accumulated over decades. But toward the back section, where the stage met the rear wall, the framework extended deeper, creating a cavity that disappeared into shadow. Sarah retrieved one of Gloria's battery-powered lanterns and angled it into the dark space. The light revealed what she'd been searching for, a metal door, small and rectangular, set into the wall beneath the stage. The door's surface was pitted with age, but intact, secured by a lock mechanism that matched the key she carried. There, she said, pointing. That's got to be it. Accessing it would require crawling into the narrow space beneath the stage, navigating between support beams in a cavity that smelled of rot and stagnant water. Sarah evaluated the approach, noting how the sloped floor made the crawl space even more confined toward the rear. An adult would have difficulty maneuvering through the restricted area, but a child Lily's size could navigate it more easily. Before Sarah could suggest an alternative approach, Lily had already moved past her, dropping to hands and knees and beginning to crawl into the dark cavity with a lantern held in front of her. The girl's movements were deliberate and careful, testing each surface before committing weight, avoiding the obvious weak points. Lily, wait, Sarah started, but her daughter was already 10 feet in, moving with surprising confidence through a space that should have been terrifying for a child who'd experienced trauma. Gloria crouched beside Sarah, watching Lily's progress. Kids got nerve. Most adults wouldn't go in there. She's been through worse, Sarah said quietly, though her hands were clenched tight with anxiety about the risks Lily was taking. The accident that killed her father, the silence that came after, she learned that fear doesn't stop bad things from happening, so there's no point letting it stop you from doing what needs doing. Lily reached the metal door and examined it with the lantern held close. She gestured back towards Sarah, pantomiming the action of inserting a key. Sarah hesitated only briefly before handing the key to Gloria, who passed it carefully to Lily through the narrow space. The girl took the key and studied it, turning it slowly in the lantern light. Then she looked at the lock, examining its mechanism with focus that suggested she was solving a puzzle rather than simply attempting to open a door. After a long moment, she shook her head and gestured again. Not a simple insertion, but a more complex movement fingers tracing patterns in the air. She's saying the key alone won't open it, Gloria interpreted. There's something else required. A sequence, maybe, or a combination. Sarah remembered May's note. Remember the pattern. Not use the key, but remember something additional. The key was necessary but insufficient. Her grandmother had added a layer of security that required knowledge beyond simple possession of the mechanism. Lily, wait there, Sarah called. Let me think about this. She climbed back onto the stage, looking for anything that might constitute a pattern. The floorboards themselves were arranged in standard parallel lines, offering no obvious code. The walls bore decorative molding, but no repeated sequence that suggested intentional communication. The ceiling panels that remained intact showed water damage, but no meaningful design. Then Sarah noticed something she'd overlooked the previous evening. Near the back edge of the stage, partially obscured by dirt and debris, were symbols carved directly into the wood. Not decorative flourishes, but deliberate markings, a series of Chinese characters arranged in a specific sequence. She knelt and cleared the debris away carefully, revealing 8 characters carved with precision that suggested professional work rather than casual graffiti. Sarah couldn't read Mandarin, but she recognized that these characters were intentional, placed here by someone who expected them to be found and understood. Gloria, do you have a phone? Something with a camera. Gloria produced a battered smartphone from her pocket, its screen cracked but functional. Sarah photographed the characters, then used the phone's translation app to identify them. The app struggled with the carved symbols, offering multiple possibilities for each character. But after several attempts at different angles and lighting, a translation emerged. Heaven's gift flows through 8 gates to those who remember Earth's foundation. The phrase felt deliberately cryptic, constructed to communicate something specific to someone who understood the reference while remaining opaque to casual observers. Sarah read it several times, testing different interpretations. 8 gates, 8 characters. The stage vault required 8 inputs, some kind of combination or sequence based on a carved message. She returned to the crawl space, calling to Lily. There are 8 characters carved into the stage floor. I think they're the pattern, the sequence needed to open the vault. Can you see if the lock has 8 positions or numbers? Lily examined the lock mechanism more closely, running her fingers over its surface with careful attention. She nodded, then held up 8 fingers, confirming that the lock indeed required an 8-digit combination or 8-position sequence. But Sarah didn't know the numbers. The characters gave her a message about gates and foundations, but no actual combination. Unless the characters themselves were the code. Their stroke order, their numerical values in Mandarin, their positions relative to each other on the stage floor. She needed help translating not just the meaning, but the numerical significance. And she had no way to access that information without internet she couldn't afford and expertise she didn't possess. Gloria had been watching this process with growing interest. You know what? There's a community center about 6 blocks from here. They run ESL classes for Mandarin speakers. Someone there might be able to help translate those characters into numbers, or at least explain what your grandmother meant. It was the first clear path forward Sarah had seen since arriving. Can you stay with Lily? I don't want her trying to force the lock or getting stuck under there. Gloria nodded. Go. We'll be fine. I'll make sure the kid doesn't do anything stupid, and she'll probably make sure I don't either. Sarah took a photograph of the carved characters with Gloria's phone, confirmed that Lily understood she was leaving temporarily, and made her way off the barge in a morning that had grown warm and heavy with humidity. The walk to the community center took her through neighborhoods that looked slightly less abandoned in daylight. Not prosperous, but lived in, showing signs of residents who'd learned to maintain dignity in circumstances that offered limited resources. The community center occupied a former church building, its architecture suggesting early 20th century optimism about civic institutions. Inside, the space had been divided into classrooms and meeting areas, the walls covered with multilingual posters about health services, legal aid, and educational opportunities. A reception desk was staffed by a young woman who looked up from her computer with practiced helpfulness. I need help translating Chinese characters, Sarah said. showing the photograph on Gloria's phone. They're carved into old wood, and I think they're part of a combination lock code. Can anyone here help me understand what they mean numerically? The receptionist studied the image, then disappeared into a back room. She returned with an older man, perhaps 70, whose movements carried the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain but refusing to surrender to it. "I'm David Wu," he said, taking the phone to examine the image more closely. "These characters are old-style, pre-simplification. Where did you find them?" "On a barge my grandmother owned. She left the key to a vault but said I needed to remember a pattern. I think these characters are the pattern." David studied the image for several minutes, occasionally enlarging sections to examine details. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something approaching concern. "Your grandmother was Taiwanese?" "Yes. She immigrated in the 70s. He nodded slowly, as if this explained something. "These characters form a phrase from traditional poetry. Heaven's gift flows through 8 gates to those who remember Earth's foundation. But they're not just a message. Each character has a numerical value based on stroke count, and arranged this way, they create a sequence." He pulled a notepad and began writing, counting strokes for each character with careful attention. After several minutes, he produced a sequence of 8 numbers, 8394175. "This is the stroke order," he explained. "If your grandmother used these characters for a combination lock, this sequence should open it. But Ms. Chen, I need to tell you something. This phrase, arranged this way, was used as a code among certain communities in the 80s and 90s, communities that needed to hide resources from authorities or protect assets from seizure." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "What kind of communities?" "Immigrant communities that didn't trust banks or government institutions. People who'd fled regimes where officials could freeze accounts or confiscate property without warning. They developed informal systems for storing wealth. Physical assets hidden in secured locations, protected by codes that required cultural knowledge to decode." He looked at her with an expression that mixed sympathy and warning. "If your grandmother used this system, whatever she hid was important enough to protect with multiple layers of security. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you're prepared for what you might find. Because resources hidden this carefully usually carry complications." Sarah thanked him, copied the numbers carefully onto the notepad he provided, and walked back toward the waterfront with thoughts that moved faster than her feet. May had purchased an abandoned barge for $600, visited it at least once to carve a coded message into the stage floor, and secured a vault with a combination that required cultural and linguistic knowledge to decode. This wasn't casual storage. This was deliberate protection of something that couldn't be trusted to conventional security. When she returned to the barge, she found Lily and Gloria sitting on the stage eating crackers from Gloria's supplies, apparently having established some form of communication during Sarah's absence. Lily's notebook lay open between them, filled with new drawings that Gloria was examining with genuine interest. "Got the numbers?" Gloria asked. Sarah nodded, holding up the notepad. 839411765. Based on the stroke count of the characters. They returned to the crawl space beneath the stage, Sarah passing the sequence to Lily, who'd remained closest to the vault door. The girls studied the numbers, then examined the lock mechanism with renewed focus. It wasn't a modern combination lock with a rotating dial, but an older design with 8 small dials arranged in a row, each numbered from 1 to 12. Lily began entering the sequence slowly, turning each dial to its corresponding number. 8, then 3, then 9, continuing through the full 8-digit code. When she set the final dial to 5, there was a moment of absolute silence where nothing happened, and Sarah felt her hope collapse into disappointment. Then a soft click echoed in the confined space, followed by the groan of metal moving for the first time in decades. The vault door had unlocked. Lily pulled the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with sounds that suggested they'd seized partially but retained enough function to operate. The interior of the vault lay in complete darkness beyond the reach of the lantern's beam. Lily extended the light inside carefully, revealing a space approximately 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Large enough to hold significant contents, small enough to be contained within the stage's support structure. The vault wasn't empty. Metal boxes were stacked inside, their surfaces dulled by age, but showing no signs of water damage. The vault had been sealed well enough to protect its contents from the moisture that pervaded the rest of the barge. Lily reached for the nearest box, but Sarah stopped her with a gesture. "Wait, let's get them all out in a better light before we start opening things. We need to see what we're dealing with." The extraction process took 30 minutes of careful crawling and passing boxes from Lily to Sarah to Gloria, creating a chain that transferred the vault's contents onto the stage. 9 boxes in total, each approximately the size of a large shoebox, each surprisingly heavy for their dimensions. They arranged the boxes in a row on the stage, the morning light revealing details that the lantern had obscured. The boxes were military surplus, designed for ammunition storage, their seals intact and showing dates stamped on their sides. 1987, 1988, 1989. May had filled and sealed these boxes in the years immediately before purchasing the barge, then transferred them here for long-term storage. Gloria stood looking at the boxes with an expression that mixed anticipation and apprehension. "You sure you want to open these? Sometimes things stay hidden for good reasons." Sarah thought about David Wu's warning, about communities that hid resources from authorities, about the complications that came with discoveries protected by multiple layers of security. Then she thought about the shelter she'd left, the jobs that wouldn't hire her, the daughter who needed stability she couldn't provide through conventional means. "We open them," she said. She selected the box dated earliest, 1987, and worked the sealed lid free. The metal resisted, then yielded with a pop that released air that had been trapped for 35 years. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and cloth, were smaller containers. Sarah removed the first and unwrapped it carefully. Gold coins spilled into her palm. Not modern commemorative pieces, but old Chinese and Taiwanese currency, each coin bearing the weight and distinctive appearance of high-purity gold. The coins had been preserved perfectly, showing no tarnish or degradation. Sarah counted them with hands that had begun to shake. 40 coins in the first container, more in the others beneath it. The box contained approximately 200 gold coins, their value determined not by face denomination, but by gold content and collector significance. Sarah had no way to calculate exact worth, but even conservative estimates suggested the single box held wealth measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lily had moved close, staring at the coins with wide eyes that reflected the golden surfaces. Gloria's expression had gone completely still, the kind of frozen shock that came from witnessing something that exceeded the boundaries of expected reality. "Holy shit," Gloria whispered. "Your grandmother was hoarding gold." Sarah opened the second box with fingers that fumbled against the seal. This box contained different currency, American gold coins from the early 20th century, carefully preserved in protective sleeves. St. Gaudens double eagles, their designs still sharp despite their age. These were rarer than the Chinese coins, their numismatic value potentially exceeding their gold content by significant margins. The third box held jewelry, not costume pieces, but serious items that spoke of wealth accumulated across lifetimes. Jade bangles carved with intricate detail, gold necklaces with clasps that suggested hand craftsmanship, rings set with stones Sarah couldn't identify, but recognized as valuable based on their size and the quality of their settings. Each piece had been wrapped individually, protected as carefully as the coins. The remaining boxes revealed similar contents, variations on the theme of portable wealth carefully stored. More coins, more jewelry, some loose gemstones, and several bundles of what appear to be old currency notes from various Asian countries. The final box contained documents, property deeds from Taiwan, stock certificates from companies that might or might not still exist, and a ledger written in Mandarin that tracked the accumulation and storage of assets across several decades. They sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by wealth that may have spent years gathering and decades hiding. The morning sun caught the gold, creating reflections that danced across the damaged walls in patterns that looked almost celebratory. But Sarah felt no celebration, only the crushing weight of understanding what this meant and what it demanded. "This is why she bought the barge," Sarah said quietly. "Not because she thought it had value, but because she needed somewhere to hide this. Somewhere official authorities wouldn't look, where property records existed, but actual inspection was unlikely. An abandoned structure in a forgotten area, perfect for long-term storage of assets she didn't trust to banks." Gloria picked up one of the gold coins, turning it slowly in the light. "How much do you think is here?" "Total." Sarah tried to calculate, but gave up quickly. The variables were too complex: gold prices, numismatic value, gemstone quality, the potential worth of vintage currency, and stock certificates. "Millions," she said finally. "Probably several $1 million at minimum, possibly much more, depending on market conditions and collector interest. And it's legally yours," Gloria added. "Inherited through proper estate channels, documented in the will. You can claim it without question." Lily had been watching this exchange with an intensity that suggested she understood more than the adults might have assumed. She picked up her notebook and drew quickly. A simple image of the three of them surrounded by the boxes, then an arrow pointing to a house with a solid roof and windows that weren't broken. The message was clear: this wealth could provide what they desperately needed. But Sarah's thoughts had already moved beyond immediate needs to the complications David Wu had warned about. Resources hidden, this carefully, usually carried complications. The phrase repeated in her mind as she looked at the fortunes spread across the stage. "We need to be careful about how we handle this," she said. "If we suddenly start trying to sell large quantities of gold coins and antique jewelry, it'll raise questions about where it came from, whether taxes were paid, whether it was legally acquired. Even if everything was legitimate, and I'm not certain it was, the appearance of impropriety could create problems." Gloria frowned. "What kind of problems?" "The kind where authorities decide to investigate, freeze assets pending review, drag out proceedings for years while lawyers consume whatever value we're trying to access. Or worse, if any of this was acquired through methods that violated laws, we could face charges just for attempting to sell it." The reality settled heavily over them. They had discovered wealth beyond their ability to easily imagine, but that wealth existed in forms that couldn't be converted to usable currency without risk. The gold needed to be authenticated, valued, and sold through channels that wouldn't immediately trigger scrutiny. The jewelry required appraisal and documentation. The stocks and bonds needed research to determine if they retained value. And all of it needed to be handled in ways that protected them legally while actually providing the resources they desperately needed. Sarah looked around the performance chamber, seeing it with new understanding. The barge wasn't just a hiding place for May's accumulated wealth. It was the only asset Sarah had that could provide legitimate context for the fortune's discovery. If she could claim ownership of the barge, restore it minimally, and present the vault discovery as something found during renovation work, the wealth would have provenance that avoided the most dangerous questions. But restoration would require time and money she didn't have. The barge was damaged, partially submerged, sitting in contaminated water on city-owned waterfront. Even minimal repairs would cost thousands she couldn't access without first selling some of what they'd found, creating a circular problem where each solution required resources only available by solving the other problem first. "We need a plan," Sarah said, more to herself than a Gloria or Lily. "A careful plan that accounts for legal requirements, market realities, and the time we need to do this properly." Gloria stood and walked to the edge of the stage, looking out at the empty seating with an expression that suggested she was calculating possibilities against risks. The city's been trying to develop this waterfront for 20 years. They want restaurants, apartments, commercial space, upscale stuff that attracts tourists and generates tax revenue. An opera barge, properly restored, could fit that vision. Historic preservation, cultural landmark, the kind of project that gets grants and tax incentives. She turned back to face Sarah. "What if we pitch it to them? Not the whole truth about what you found, but the basic idea. You've inherited the barge. You want to restore it. You're looking for municipal support in exchange for creating something that serves public interest. historic venue, community performance space, whatever angle gets them invested. It was a good idea in theory, but Sarah immediately saw the practical obstacles. Restoration would cost hundreds of thousands, probably millions. No city program provides that kind of funding up front, and any grants would require matching funds we don't have. Plus, the moment we start an official restoration project, we'd have inspectors and contractors and oversight examining every inch of this structure. They'd find a vault, or we'd have to disclose it, and then we're back to answering questions about where the contents came from. Lily had been listening to this exchange with focus that suggested she was processing every word despite her silence. She pulled her notebook close and began drawing again, this time creating a more complex image. She drew the barge, then drew it transformed, the damaged sections repaired, the windows intact, the structure sitting level in the water instead of listing. Around the restored barge, she drew crowds of people, stick figures with happy faces, suggesting performances and audiences, and the barge functioning as it had been designed to function. Beneath this image, she drew the boxes of gold, but smaller, some of them crossed out. She looked at Sarah and pointed to the drawing, then made a gesture that suggested gradual movement, selling some, restoring some, building toward the vision of the restored barge incrementally rather than all at once. "She's right," Gloria said, interpreting the drawing. "You don't need to do everything immediately. Sell what you can safely. Use those funds to make minimal repairs. Establish the barge as an active project rather than an abandoned structure. Each stage makes the next stage more legitimate." Sarah studied her daughter's drawing, seeing the wisdom in an 8-year-old's simplified approach. Trying to solve everything at once created paralysis. Breaking the problem into manageable pieces made action possible. "All right," she said slowly, feeling the decision take shape as she spoke. "First step, I need to officially transfer ownership and establish legal claim to the barge. That's paperwork, maybe some fees, but it's achievable. Second step, sell a small portion of the gold through legitimate channels, coin dealers, auction houses, places that handle estate sales regularly. Enough to generate funds for immediate needs and initial repairs, not so much that it raises red flags." She paused, thinking through the sequence. Third step, use those funds to address the most critical safety issues. Pump out the water in the stern section, stabilize the listing, repair the worst of the roof damage. Make it look like active preservation rather than abandonment. Fourth step, apply for historic status and renovation grants, using the barge's history and our initial investment as proof of serious intent. Gloria nodded slowly. "And keep the full extent of what you found quiet. Let people assume you're funding this through normal means, personal savings, small loans, whatever. The less attention on the vault, the less risk of complications." It was a plan built on deception by omission, on presenting partial truths while concealing the fuller reality. Sarah felt the moral weight of that choice, understanding that she was stepping into territory where legality and ethics became ambiguous. But she also remembered the shelter, the rejection letters, the mathematics that allowed no path forward through conventional means. Sometimes survival required working in the spaces between rules written by people who'd never experienced desperation. The rest of the morning was spent organizing their discovery carefully. They returned all but 2 boxes to the vault, selecting the containers that held the most liquid assets, American gold coins that could be sold without requiring extensive authentication, and some of the less distinctive jewelry. These they would take with them for immediate conversion. The rest would remain secured in the vault, protected by the combination lock and a crawl space that made access difficult for anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Sarah secured the vault door, Lily re-verifying that the lock mechanism had reset properly. They climbed out from beneath the stage and stood looking at the 2 boxes they'd kept, feeling the weight of both opportunity and responsibility they represented. "Where will you go?" Gloria asked. "Can't exactly walk into a coin shop with this much gold without raising questions." Sarah had been thinking about this. The city must have legitimate dealers, places that handle estate sales and antique jewelry regularly. "I'll research them. Find someone reputable who won't ask too many questions about a small sale. I'll present it as items from my grandmother's estate that I'm liquidating to fund a restoration project. It's close enough to truth that I can deliver it without obvious deception. Gloria considered this, then nodded. Makes sense. And what about you two? Where are you staying while you work this out? The question landed heavily. Sarah had exactly $23 remaining, not enough for even one night at the cheapest motel. She planned to claim the Barge ownership and figure out accommodation later, but later had arrived faster than she'd anticipated. We'll figure something out, Sarah said, the phrase feeling hollow even as she spoke it. Gloria's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on resignation, mixed with something that might have been compassion. The dressing room where you slept last night. It's yours if you want it. Won't charge you rent because I can't. I don't own this place any more than you did yesterday. But if you're serious about restoring the Barge, having someone here regularly makes sense. Discourages squatters, makes the project look active. Fair trade. Sarah felt gratitude that exceeded her ability to articulate it properly. We'll contribute. Once I sell some of the coins, we'll cover food costs, supplies, whatever we can manage. Deal. Gloria extended her hand, and they shook on an arrangement that existed outside any formal contract or legal structure. Three people who'd reached the end of conventional options, creating an alternative through necessity and mutual recognition that survival sometimes required building systems that bureaucracy didn't acknowledge. Lily had been watching this exchange with an expression that suggested she understood they'd just secured something crucial. Not just shelter, but a base from which to work, a place where they could exist while building towards something more permanent. She moved to Gloria and hugged her with the fierce intensity of someone expressing gratitude that words would have diminished. Gloria accepted the embrace awkwardly at first, then with growing comfort, her hands settling on Lily's shoulders with gentle pressure. "You're a good kid," she said quietly. "Don't let the world convince you otherwise." The afternoon was spent planning next steps with the methodical attention of people who understood that mistakes would be costly. Sarah used Gloria's phone to research coin dealers in the city, identifying 3 that appeared legitimate and well-established. She drafted a story for the gold coins, inherited from her grandmother, part of an estate she was settling, funds needed for property restoration. The story was simple, verifiable in its broad strokes, and avoided the complications of explaining the vault or the full extent of the fortune. Tomorrow she would visit the dealers, starting with the smallest sale she could manage while still generating enough capital for immediate needs. She estimated that selling 20 coins would produce approximately $30,000 to $40,000 based on current gold prices and the coin's numismatic value. Enough to transfer Barge ownership, address basic safety concerns, and provide modest living expenses for several months. But tonight they had shelter, they had hope, and they had each other in a space that had once celebrated human voices raised in performance. Lily stood on the stage as evening light began filling the chamber with warm colors. Her arms spread slightly, as they had been the previous evening, testing how it felt to occupy this position. Sarah watched her daughter claim the stage with growing understanding. Lily had lost her voice, but she'd found this place where voices had once mattered, where performance had been celebrated, where people had gathered to witness others expressing what couldn't be contained in ordinary conversation. Perhaps restoring this space wasn't just about accessing May's hidden wealth. Perhaps it was about creating a place where Lily could exist without speech, where communication through art and presence mattered more than the words she couldn't produce. Gloria joined Sarah at the stage's edge, both women watching the silent girl test the space's acoustics with movements rather than sound. "She's going to be all right," Gloria said quietly. "Might not get her voice back tomorrow or next month, but she's going to be all right. Kid that tough doesn't stay broken forever." Sarah wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But she'd learned that trauma didn't follow rules or timelines, that recovery couldn't be demanded or scheduled. All she could do was provide stability, safety, and the space for Lily to heal at whatever pace healing required. The river continued its patient movement beneath them, rocking the barge with gentle persistence that had become almost comforting in its constancy. Above, the sky began revealing stars through the gaps in the damaged ceiling, each point of light sharp and distant. The city around them settled into evening rhythms, traffic sounds diminishing, voices carrying across water, the industrial hum transitioning to nighttime frequencies. Inside the Empress Opera Barge, three people who'd been separated by circumstance had formed an alliance built on necessity and unexpected discovery. A grandmother's carefully hidden fortune had been revealed, offering possibilities that range from immediate survival to long-term transformation. The path forward remained uncertain, complicated by legal questions and practical obstacles that couldn't be solved quickly. But they had tonight. They had shelter and security and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring opportunities to act rather than just react. They had each other, Sarah and Lily, bound by blood and loss and love that exceeded language. Gloria, bound by recognition that some battles were better fought together than alone. And they had this place, damaged, listing, officially abandoned, but secretly vital. A structure that had survived 35 years of neglect specifically so it could serve this purpose, providing refuge for people who needed it, concealing resources until someone worthy finally asked the right questions, existing as proof that abandonment sometimes preceded rediscovery rather than destruction. Sarah settled beside Lily on the stage, both of them looking out at the empty seating that would someday, if the plan succeeded, hold audiences again. Gloria sat nearby, comfortable in the silence that filled the space where music and voices had once commanded attention. Tomorrow would test their resolve and their planning. Tomorrow they would begin converting hidden wealth into practical resources, transforming discovery into action, proving that May's $600 gamble on abandoned dream had been visionary rather than foolish. But tonight, they simply existed in the space between what had been and what might be, three survivors claiming temporary peace in a structure designed for celebration that had learned to offer sanctuary instead. The darkness settled completely, broken only by the battery-powered lantern's glow and the distant lights of the city reflecting off water that had carried this barge through decades of waiting. The stage remained solid beneath them. The vault remained secure below, and the fortune remained hidden, ready to be revealed gradually, carefully, in ways that protected those who'd finally found what May had left behind. Not just wealth, but opportunity, purpose, and proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritances came wrapped in abandonment, waiting for the right people to recognize worth that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Morning brought purpose that felt different from the previous day's discovery. Sarah woke with a list of tasks that transformed abstract possibility into concrete action. Transfer ownership, sell coins, establish legitimacy. Each step simple in isolation, each carrying consequences that would ripple forward into futures she couldn't fully predict. She dressed in the single professional outfit she'd carried from the shelter, slacks and a blouse that showed their age but maintained enough dignity to suggest competence rather than desperation. Lily helped by using her small hands to smooth the wrinkles that refused to release from fabric that had spent too long compressed in a backpack. Gloria provided coffee again, along with directions to the municipal office that handled property transfers. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, she warned. They'll want documentation you might not have, fees you didn't expect, and forms that reference other forms that nobody told you about. Stay patient, stay polite, and remember that clerks have more power to help or hurt you than their job titles suggest. Sarah took 2 of the American gold coins from the box they'd secured in the dressing room, sliding them into her pocket alongside the estate documents. Emergency currency if the transfer fees exceeded her remaining cash. She left Lily with Gloria, both of them understanding that navigating bureaucracy would be faster without a silent 8-year-old raising questions about childcare arrangements. The walk to the municipal building took her through the city's commercial district, where morning crowds moved with the practiced efficiency of people navigating familiar routes toward predictable destinations. Sarah felt acutely aware of how she didn't fit these patterns, her uncertainty visible in hesitant steps, her exhaustion apparent in the way she carried herself. She forced her posture straighter, her pace more confident, performing competence even when she felt hollowed out by anxiety about what might go wrong. The municipal building occupied an entire block, its architecture suggesting an era when government construction aspired to permanence rather than cost efficiency. Inside, the reality was less impressive. Fluorescent lights humming over worn linoleum, plastic chairs arranged in waiting areas that suggested hours of forced patience, signs directing visitors through a maze of departmental jurisdictions that seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate. Sarah found the property transfer office on the third floor, entering a room where 6 people sat waiting and 3 clerks moved with the deliberate slowness of civil servants who understood that efficiency wasn't rewarded in systems that measured success by procedural compliance rather than outcomes. She waited 90 minutes before reaching a clerk whose nameplate identified her as Margaret Ross. The woman looked to be in her 50s, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent decades navigating regulations that changed constantly while fundamentally remaining the same. "Estate transfer," Sarah said, sliding the documents across the counter. "My grandmother owned property in the city. She died 3 weeks ago. I'm her sole heir according to probate court in Ohio. I need to transfer ownership into my name." Margaret examined the documents with practiced skepticism, reading dates and signatures with the attention of someone trained to spot irregularities. "The property address listed here, that's the old Opera Barge down in Section 7. That thing's still standing. Partially. It's listing but structurally intact. I'm planning to restore it." Margaret's expression shifted from neutral bureaucracy to something approaching concern. "That section of waterfront is contaminated. Industrial runoff from the 50s and 60s. The city's been trying to clean it up for decades, but funding keeps getting delayed. Building permits down there are nearly impossible to get." Sarah felt her carefully constructed plan beginning to fracture. "I'm not building new construction. I'm restoring an existing historic structure. That's different from ground-up development, isn't it?" "Maybe. Depends on how the zoning commission interprets the regulations, and they don't interpret generously." Margaret pulled up records on her computer, scrolling through information that produced increasingly troubled expressions. "Your grandmother purchased this in 1989 for $600 at auction. City's been charging minimal property tax because it was designated uninhabitable. But if you're planning restoration, that designation changes. Property gets reassessed at market value. Taxes increase accordingly." "What's market value for a partially sunken barge in contaminated water?" Margaret continued scrolling. "According to this, the city commissioned an evaluation in 2019 as part of waterfront development planning. They assessed the barge at $280,000 based on its historic significance and the property footprint. If you restore it and make it habitable, assessment could reach $700,000 or more. You'd be looking at annual property taxes around $12,000, maybe higher." The numbers landed like physical blows. Sarah had anticipated transfer fees, but not reassessment that would create ongoing obligations she couldn't meet without converting more of the hidden wealth than she'd planned. The careful strategy of gradual liquidation suddenly felt inadequate against expenses that would consume resources faster than safe sales could generate them. "What if I don't restore it immediately? What if I just transfer ownership and maintain current status? Then taxes stay at the current rate, about $400 annually. But the structure remains legally uninhabitable. You can't live there, can't operate a business there, can't host public events. It's essentially storage, and even that's questionable given the safety violations." Sarah forced herself to think through the implications. She needed the barge as context for the vault discovery, which meant she needed to establish active restoration efforts. But active restoration would trigger reassessment and tax obligations she couldn't sustain without selling more gold, which created risks of attracting exactly the scrutiny she was trying to avoid. How long does reassessment take? From starting restoration work to getting the new tax bill? Margaret considered this. Officially, the city's supposed to conduct assessments annually. Realistically, they're understaffed and behind schedule. If you filed for a restoration permit today, it might be 12 to 18 months before anyone got around to reassessing. Longer if you're not actively pushing for inspections. A window, then. Time to work carefully, to convert resources gradually, to build towards sustainability before obligations became crushing. Sarah felt the strategy reforming around these new constraints. All right, I want to transfer ownership and maintain current status for now. What do I need to do? The process consumed another 2 hours of form completion, notarization, and fee payment. The transfer itself cost $430, consuming most of Sarah's remaining cash. But when Margaret finally handed her the recorded deed, Sarah held legal proof that the Empress Opera barge belonged to her, not as a functional property, but as a legally recognized asset she controlled. One more thing, Margaret said as Sarah prepared to leave. The city's got a program for historic preservation. They offer small grants, 5 to 10,000, for initial stabilization work on structures that meet certain criteria. Your barge might qualify. Application process is competitive, but having the deed in your name is the first requirement. Sarah took the information packet Margaret provided, recognizing it as potential leverage. A grant would offer legitimate funding that didn't require explaining where else resources came from. Even if the grant itself was small, it established a paper trail of support that made later investment more credible. She left the municipal building with the deed, the grant information, and $3 remaining in her pocket. The gold coins she'd brought as emergency backup were still secure and used. She'd cleared the first hurdle. The coin dealer she'd selected was located in a commercial district that specialized in antiques and collectibles. The shop occupied a corner storefront with security bars on the windows and cameras visible above the entrance. Inside, display cases held coins, currency, and medals arranged with the care of someone who understood both market value and historical significance. The proprietor was a man in his 60s who introduced himself as Robert Chen. No relation, he clarified immediately, though the coincidence of shared surnames created a moment of connection. He listened to Sarah's story about her grandmother's estate with professional neutrality, examining the 20 gold coins she'd brought with practiced attention. St. Gaudens's double eagles, he confirmed, using a loupe to inspect details. These are from the 20s, good condition, no obvious cleaning or damage. You said your grandmother was an immigrant? From Taiwan. She came over in the 70s, worked in restaurants and garment factories. I think she saved these over the years, maybe brought some with her when she immigrated. Robert nodded slowly. Makes sense. A lot of immigrants from that generation didn't trust banks, especially if they'd experienced political instability where governments could freeze accounts. Gold coins were portable wealth that held value across borders. You see this pattern a lot in estate sales. He continued his examination, occasionally making notes. After 20 minutes, he looked up with an expression that suggested he'd reached conclusions that complicated simple transactions. These coins are worth approximately $1,800 to $2,000 each based on current gold spot price and numismatic value. For the full 20, I can offer $36,000. That's a fair price, not the absolute maximum you'd get at auction, but auction takes time and comes with fees. This is immediate cash, clean transaction. Sarah felt relief that the amount aligned with her estimates. That works. How does the sale process work? I'll need to see ID, record the transaction for tax purposes, and provide you with documentation for your own records. The IRS requires reporting on cash transactions over $10,000, so this will be filed. I assume you're prepared to handle tax implications on the estate. Yes, Sarah lied, making a mental note to research tax obligations she hadn't considered. Another complication, another layer of bureaucracy to navigate carefully. The transaction took an hour to complete properly. Robert was meticulous about documentation, creating records that protected both parties while ensuring the sale could withstand scrutiny if questioned. When he finally handed Sarah a cashier's check for $36,000, she felt the weight of possibility settle alongside persistent anxiety about everything that could still go wrong. One piece of advice, Robert said as she prepared to leave. If you have more coins to sell, space out the transactions. Liquidating a large estate all at once raises questions about provenance, about whether assets were properly disclosed to probate court, about tax obligations. Selling gradually over several months looks more like someone carefully managing an inheritance rather than someone trying to move questionable assets quickly. Sarah thanked him for the advice, understanding that his caution protected his business as much as it protected her. She left the shop with the check, a receipt, and documentation that established this transaction as legitimate and traceable. The first conversion of hidden wealth into usable resources, executed carefully enough to avoid immediate complications. She returned to the barge as afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening gold. Lily and Gloria were on the stage, apparently engaged in some kind of drawing game where Gloria would describe something and Lily would sketch it. Then Lily would draw something and Gloria would try to interpret it. They looked up when Sarah entered, both reading her expression for indication of success or failure. "Got the deed," Sarah announced, holding up the document. "The barge is officially mine, and I sold 20 coins for $36,000. Gloria whistled low. "That's more than I've seen in aggregate in 6 years. What's the plan?" Sarah settled onto the stage beside them, feeling exhaustion compete with cautious optimism. First priority, pump out the stern section and stabilize the listing. If the barge sinks completely or lists further, everything else becomes moot. Second priority, minimal roof repairs to prevent additional water damage. Third priority, address the worst safety hazards so we can claim active restoration is underway. All of it needs to look legitimate but cost-effective, like someone working with limited resources rather than hiding significant wealth. She pulled out the grant information Margaret had provided. There's also a city program for historic preservation. Small grants, but legitimate funding that creates a paper trail. I'm going to apply, even if we don't need the money. Having city investment makes the whole project more credible. Gloria nodded slowly, processing the strategy. Smart. And what about living situation? You two planning to stay here long-term? Sarah looked around the damaged chamber, calculating what long-term might mean in these circumstances. Until we can establish something more stable. Could be months. Is that a problem? Opposite of a problem. Having people here regularly makes everything safer. Less likely someone breaks in or the city decides to condemn it when they see it's not completely abandoned. Lily had been listening to this exchange with focus that suggested she was tracking every detail. She pulled her notebook close and drew a new image, the barge but transformed. The listing corrected, the roof repaired, the windows intact. Around it she drew herself and Sarah, standing on solid ground rather than uncertain footing. The drawing captured hope without demanding immediate transformation, acknowledging that change would be gradual. "She gets it," Gloria said quietly. "Understands this is going to take time." The following weeks established rhythms that felt almost sustainable. Sarah opened a bank account and deposited the check from Robert, establishing financial legitimacy that had been absent from her life since losing her job. She applied for the historic preservation grant, crafting an application that emphasized community value and cultural significance without mentioning the vault or the full extent of resources she could access. She hired a marine salvage company to pump out the stern section, explaining that she wanted to stabilize her inherited property before decay progressed further. The work took 3 days and cost $8,000, but when it was complete, the barge sat noticeably more level in the water. The listing hadn't been eliminated entirely, but had been reduced from 45 degrees to approximately 20, making the interior substantially more navigable. With Gloria's help, Sarah identified the most critical roof damage and hired a contractor who specialized in historic restoration. The work was careful and expensive, $15,000 to replace collapsed sections while maintaining period-appropriate materials and techniques. But when it was finished, the interior was protected from weather, and the barge looked less like an abandoned ruin and more like a project underway. She spent evenings researching tax obligations for inherited assets, discovering that her grandmother's gold had potentially complicated implications. If May had purchased the coins legally and held them for decades, selling them as estate assets was straightforward. But if any portion had been acquired through methods that avoided taxation, and the evidence suggested May had been part of communities that specifically structured their finances to minimize government oversight, then liquidation could trigger questions about whether proper estate taxes had been paid. Sarah made careful notes about what she could claim with confidence and what required careful presentation. She kept meticulous records of every transaction, creating documentation that would withstand scrutiny while avoiding disclosures that might invite deeper investigation. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention and generated persistent anxiety about making mistakes she wouldn't recognize until they produced consequences. Lily enrolled in the local school as autumn approached, registered using the Barge's address with documentation that established Sarah as legal guardian and property owner. The school had questions about their living situation. The Barge wasn't zoned residential, and its condition raised concerns about whether it met basic habitability standards. Sarah navigated these questions with partial truths that satisfied immediate concerns without inviting deeper inspection. They were temporarily staying in the structure while restoration work proceeded. Sarah had resources to provide for her daughter's needs. Lily had medical documentation explaining her selective mutism and required no special services beyond patience from teachers who understood she wouldn't speak but could communicate through writing and gesture. The school, overwhelmed and understaffed, accepted these explanations with relief that Sarah wasn't demanding additional support. Lily was enrolled, provided with supplies purchased from the early proceeds of gold sales, and integrated into a classroom where her silence was noted but not treated as crisis requiring intervention. She made friends with unexpected ease. Other children were drawn to her drawings, to the notebook where she documented everything, to the quiet intensity she brought to observing the world. She communicated through sketches that captured her classmates with such accuracy that they recognized themselves immediately, through gestures that carried meaning without requiring speech, through presence that suggested wisdom beyond her years. Sarah watched her daughter adapt with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Lily shouldn't have to work this hard to be understood. She shouldn't have to translate herself constantly for people who took their own voices for granted. But she did it anyway, claiming space in a world that hadn't made room for her, proving that communication existed in forms beyond the words that had been taken from her. 3 months after Sarah had first opened the vault, the historic preservation grant came through, $8,000 to support continued restoration work on a structure the city had quietly given up on decades earlier. The grant officer who delivered the news seemed genuinely pleased, describing the Empress as exactly the kind of project the program was designed to support. "We've had developers circling the waterfront for years," she explained. "They want to tear down everything old and build generic condos and chain restaurants. Having someone willing to preserve historic structures gives us leverage to demand better outcomes. Your Barge becomes an anchor, proof that this area has cultural value worth protecting." Sarah accepted the grant money and the implied alliance it created. The city had unwittingly invested in a project that was being funded primarily through her grandmother's hidden fortune, creating a paper trail that legitimized everything while obscuring the actual source of most resources. With the grant and proceeds from selling additional coins, she'd made 3 more transactions, spacing them carefully across different dealers in neighboring cities. Sarah had accumulated approximately $90,000 in documented, accessible funds. She used portions of this to address additional restoration work, electrical system updates that brought the Barge up to minimum code, plumbing repairs that made water access functional, and structural reinforcement that satisfied engineers enough to declare the building stable, if not exactly safe by modern standards. Gloria continued occupying her small section of the Barge, but the relationship had evolved from squatter accepting temporary generosity to something approaching partnership. She knew about the vault. Impossible to hide, given that Sarah periodically accessed it to retrieve coins for conversion. But she never asked questions about the full extent of what remained hidden. Some knowledge they both understood was safer left unstated. Winter arrived gradually, temperature dropping and daylight shortening, transforming the river into something darker and more ominous. The barge's heating system was marginal at best, a combination of space heaters and the restored central furnace that Gloria had kept barely functional for years. They adapted by layering clothing, by spending evenings clustered in the performance chamber where the heaters concentrated warmth, by accepting discomfort as the price of maintaining shelter that bureaucracy couldn't easily take away. Lily turned 9 in December. Sarah organized a small celebration on the stage, inviting 3 of Lily's classmates and their parents who'd expressed curiosity about where the quiet girl with the remarkable drawings actually lived. The event served multiple purposes, giving Lily a real birthday party for the first time since her father's death, demonstrating to other parents that their living situation was unconventional but safe, and creating social connections that reduced isolation. The parents toured the barge with expressions that mixed surprise and concern. The restoration work was obvious. The repaired roof, the improved electrical, the structural reinforcement. But so was the reality that this remained a marginal living situation. One mother pulled Sarah aside with gentle concern about whether she needed help, whether there were resources she could access, whether Lily was truly safe in these circumstances. Sarah provided reassurance that felt simultaneously dishonest and accurate. They were fine. They had resources. The living situation was temporary while restoration continued. Everything would stabilize soon. The mother accepted these explanations with visible doubt, but didn't push further. Sarah understood she'd been assessed and provisionally approved, placed in a category of unconventional but managing that wouldn't trigger immediate intervention unless circumstances deteriorated visibly. That night, after the party had ended and the guests had departed, Sarah sat on the stage with Lily and Gloria, surrounded by decorations that looked simultaneously festive and sad. Lily had received gifts, art supplies, books, a jacket that actually fit properly, and had responded with drawings she'd created for each guest, portraits that captured their essential characteristics with remarkable accuracy for a 9-year-old. "You did good," Gloria said, gesturing at the lingering evidence of celebration. "Kid had a real birthday. That matters." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of everything they'd accomplished and everything that still felt uncertain. They'd survived 4 months. The barge was marginally habitable. Lily was enrolled in school and making friends. Sarah had legitimate income from grant funding and could access additional resources through careful gold sales. They'd built something approaching stability from components that shouldn't have fit together. But she also felt the fragility of their situation. One aggressive city inspector could condemn the barge and force them out. One teacher's mandatory report could trigger child welfare investigations that would examine their living circumstances with skepticism. One mistake in managing the hidden wealth, selling too much too quickly, failing to properly document transactions, triggering tax investigations, could unravel everything they'd built. She was $37,000 into converting May's fortune, with millions remaining secured in the vault beneath the stage. The temptation to sell more, to accelerate restoration, to create security through financial abundance, pressed against the caution that kept her moving slowly. "Robert, the coin dealer, told me something," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He said immigrants from May's generation often acquired gold through informal networks. Community pools where people contributed cash and received metal at bulk prices, avoiding taxes and government tracking. Legal in the sense that gold ownership is legal, but questionable in terms of whether proper documentation existed." Gloria frowned. "You thinking the gold might be problematic?" "I'm thinking we don't know its full history. May was careful enough to hide it with codes and vault security. That suggests she understood that claiming it openly could invite questions she didn't want to answer. Which means we're inheriting not just wealth, but whatever risks came with how it was acquired. So what are you going to do?" Sarah looked at Lily, who'd been listening with the focus that suggested she understood more than adults typically credited children with comprehending. "We continue moving carefully, converting what we need when we need it, building legitimacy through documented restoration work, creating a context where the wealth looks like it's being discovered gradually rather than already known. We turn this barge into something real, a functioning venue, a community resource, something valuable enough that questions about funding get answered with successful restoration project rather than deeper investigation. It was a long-term strategy that required patience Sarah didn't naturally possess and skills she was learning through necessity rather than training. But she was 43 years old. She'd survived the death of her husband and the dissolution of her entire previous life. And she'd learned that adaptation mattered more than plans when circumstances refused to cooperate with expectations. Spring arrived with a particular intensity that belonged to northern climates, where winter felt like it might never end, and then suddenly did. The river shed its dark winter aspect, becoming something almost inviting under sunlight that carried actual warmth. The barge, properly stabilized and partially restored, looked less like a ruin and more like a structure with purpose. Sarah hired a structural engineer to conduct a comprehensive assessment, documenting that the barge was sound enough to support greater renovation efforts. The report cost $3,000 but provided crucial legitimacy, professional confirmation that the project was viable rather than foolish. She used this report to apply for additional grants and to begin conversations with historical societies about potential designation as a cultural landmark. The designation process revealed unexpected allies. Architectural historians were fascinated by the barge's survival, describing it as one of the last intact examples of floating performance venues that had once been common on American waterways. Cultural preservationists saw it as a bridge to immigrant communities' contributions to regional arts. Economic development officials recognized it as exactly the kind of unique attraction that could anchor waterfront revitalization without requiring generic commercialization. Sarah learned to navigate these different constituencies, presenting the barge as whatever each group most wanted to see. A historic structure deserving protection, a community asset needing support, an economic catalyst requiring investment. She'd spent 15 years managing corporate projects, coordinating stakeholders with competing interests toward common goals. Those skills translated surprisingly well to managing a restoration project where success depended on making disparate groups believe they shared objectives. By late spring, formal landmark designation was progressing through bureaucratic channels. Additional grant funding had been secured, $30,000 from a state historic preservation program, $15,000 from a regional arts council, $22,000 from a waterfront development initiative. None of these funding sources knew about the vault or the gold. All of them believed they were supporting a dedicated individual restoring a culturally significant structure through remarkable personal commitment and careful resource management. The accumulating grants created leverage Sarah hadn't anticipated. With nearly $80,000 in official funding, she could justify hiring proper contractors for major restoration work without explaining where additional resources came from. She presented herself as someone matching grant funding with personal investment, legally accurate, since the gold had been inherited and thus was legitimately personal assets, even if the full extent wasn't disclosed. She hired a restoration firm that specialized in historic structures, briefing them carefully about what needed to be accomplished. The performance chamber required extensive work. New seating to replace the rusted frames, stage refinishing to restore the wood surface, acoustic. Treatments to recover the sound quality the space had been designed to provide. The firm's estimates came in at $250,000 for comprehensive restoration. Sarah negotiated carefully, creating a phased approach where the most critical work happened first, with additional phases triggered as funding became available. She paid for Phase 1, structural completion and basic chamber restoration. Using grant money supplemented by $40,000 from gold sales she'd conducted over the previous 6 months. The work took 3 months, transforming the performance chamber from damaged ruin into something that could legitimately host audiences again. The seating was installed in configurations that honored the original design while meeting modern safety codes. The stage was refinished to restore the wood's natural beauty, the surface carefully preserved to maintain evidence of its age and history. Acoustic panels were installed using techniques that mimicked the original construction, creating sound distribution that professionals tested and confirmed as exceptional. When the work was complete, Sarah stood in the restored chamber with Lily and Gloria, looking at what they'd created from components that shouldn't have assembled into anything functional. The space was beautiful, not pristine or perfect, but honest in its restoration, showing its age while reclaiming its purpose. Lily climbed onto the stage and stood at its center, looking out at seating that could now actually hold people. She spread her arms slightly, testing the space as she had months earlier, but this time the gesture carried different meaning. Not asking whether this could become home, but acknowledging that it already had. Gloria's voice came quietly from beside Sarah. Your grandmother would be proud. She hid wealth to protect it, but I think she hoped someone would eventually use it for this, bringing the place back to life instead of just extracting value and abandoning it again. Sarah thought about May, who'd spent $600 on a dream everyone else had dismissed as garbage, who'd worked in kitchens and factories, saving carefully, building wealth through patient accumulation and careful protection, who'd hidden that wealth not because it was illegal, but because she didn't trust systems that claimed authority over assets they hadn't helped create, who'd left everything to a granddaughter she'd barely known, trusting that blood would recognize value that strangers couldn't see. I want to host something, Sarah said, the idea forming as she spoke. A performance. Something that demonstrates this space works, that it can serve its original purpose again. Not a grand reopening. That implies we're done, and we're not. But a proof of concept. Evidence that restoration is achieving something real. Gloria nodded slowly. What kind of performance? Sarah looked at Lily, who was moving across the stage with movements that suggested choreography, creating patterns through gesture rather than speech. Something that doesn't require words. Dance, maybe, or visual storytelling. Something my daughter could participate in if she wanted to, where silence wouldn't be a limitation. Over the following weeks, Sarah reached out to local performing arts organizations, describing the restored venue and offering it as a space for experimental work that might not fit conventional theaters. The responses were cautious at first. Curiosity mixed with skepticism about whether a barge floating in a river could actually support professional performances. But one group responded with genuine enthusiasm. A modern dance company that specialized in site-specific work, creating pieces designed for unconventional spaces. Their artistic director visited the barge, walked through the performance chamber, tested the stage and the acoustics, and declared it perfect for a piece they'd been developing about transformation and resilience. The performance was scheduled for June, giving the company 6 weeks to adapt their choreography to the space. Sarah secured minimal funding through the Arts Council grant to cover production costs, positioning the event as a community showcase rather than a commercial venture. Admission would be free, with donations encouraged to support continued restoration. She promoted the event carefully through social media and local press, framing it as the first public demonstration of the opera barge's potential. The story attracted attention. Abandoned historic venue restored by determined single mother, now hosting its first performance in decades. Media coverage was sympathetic, portraying Sarah as someone fighting to preserve cultural heritage against bureaucratic indifference and economic pressure. What the coverage didn't mention was the vault, the gold, or the fortune that funded most of what appeared to be resourceful determination. That story remained hidden, protected by careful documentation and the simple fact that people preferred heartwarming narratives about scrappy underdogs over complex truths about inherited wealth that couldn't be easily explained. Lily became involved in the production as an assistant to the artistic director, helping to document rehearsals through photographs and sketches. The dancers, learning about her selective mutism, adapted their work to include her observations, asking her to draw what she saw in their movements and using her interpretations to refine their choreography. Sarah watched her daughter engage with professional artists who valued her silence as perspective rather than treating it as deficit. Lily's drawings captured qualities in the dancers, movements they hadn't consciously expressed, revealing emotional content that informed subsequent rehearsals. She became essential to the creative process, not despite her inability to speak, but because her silence had taught her to observe with attention most people never developed. The night of the performance arrived with weather that cooperated perfectly. Clear sky, mild temperature, the river calm enough that the barge's gentle rocking enhanced rather than distracted from the event. Seating that had been tested but never used filled with audience members drawn by curiosity and media coverage. Approximately 150 people, the maximum capacity safety regulations allowed. Sarah stood at the entrance greeting guests, checking names against the RSVP list, managing logistics with competence developed through months of navigating challenges that had no clear precedents. She wore clothing purchased specifically for this occasion, professional but not expensive, suggesting someone who'd invested in presentation without abundant resources. Gloria worked crowd control, directing people to seating and bathrooms with authority that came from 6 years of living in the structure and knowing its quirks better than anyone. She'd cleaned up for the occasion, wearing clothes Sarah had helped her select, carrying herself with dignity that challenged anyone to dismiss her as merely a homeless squatter who'd been tolerated out of charity. Lily moved through the crowd with her notebook, documenting faces and reactions, creating a visual record of the evening that would supplement the official photography. People recognized her for media coverage and spoke to her with gentle respect, reading her responses in gesture and expression, adapting to her communication style without demanding she conform to theirs. When everyone was seated and the house lights dimmed, Sarah stood on the stage to offer brief remarks. She kept them simple, acknowledging the restoration work, thanking the grants and supporters who'd made it possible, explaining that tonight represented not an ending, but a beginning, proof that the opera barge could reclaim its purpose as a space where performance and community intersected. She didn't mention her grandmother, the vault, or the $600 that had started everything. Those details belonged to a different story, one that existed beneath the narrative she was presenting to an audience that preferred inspiration to complexity. The performance itself was remarkable. The dancers used the stage's restored surface and the chamber's exceptional acoustics to create movement that felt amplified by architecture designed to enhance rather than constrain artistic expression. They'd incorporated the space's history into their choreography, sequences that referenced the barge's listing angle, movements that echoed the water's presence beneath them, gestures that acknowledged the structure's survival against circumstances that should have destroyed it. During the final sequence, the artistic director invited Lily onto the stage. The girl moved from the wings with careful confidence, joining the dancers in a closing section they'd choreographed specifically to include her. She moved through patterns they'd taught her, her silence becoming part of the performance's vocabulary, her presence demonstrating that expression existed in forms beyond speech. The audience responded with sustained applause that felt genuine rather than merely polite. People stood, their appreciation acknowledging both the artistic achievement and the improbable success of restoring a space that had been abandoned for decades. Sarah felt tears threaten, fought them back, and allowed herself a moment of recognition that they'd accomplished something significant. After the performance, audience members lingered, exploring the space, asking questions about restoration plans, expressing interest in attending future events. Several offered donations substantially larger than Sarah had anticipated. $100 bills from people who'd been moved by the performance and wanted to support the project's continuation. A city council member approached Sarah with an expression suggesting political calculations alongside genuine appreciation. This is exactly the kind of project our waterfront needs. Historic preservation that creates community value rather than just developer profit. I'd like to discuss how the city might provide additional support. Sarah responded with appropriate gratitude while maintaining careful distance. Support was welcome, but too much official attention could invite scrutiny she still preferred to avoid. She provided vague assurances about future conversations, offering just enough encouragement to maintain goodwill without committing to entanglements that might constrain her flexibility. As the evening concluded and the last guest departed, Sarah, Gloria, and Lily stood on the stage in the empty chamber, exhausted and satisfied in equal measure. They'd proven something crucial, that the barge could function as intended, that restoration was producing real results, that the vision driving their work was viable rather than delusional. "We did it," Gloria said simply. "All the way from condemned wreck to this. We actually fucking did it." Lily pulled out her notebook and drew quickly. The three of them standing on the stage, surrounded by seated figures representing the evening's audience. Above them a roof that no longer leaked, beneath them a structure that no longer listed dangerously. The drawing captured transformation while acknowledging that more work remained. Sarah gathered them both close, feeling gratitude that exceeded language. Phase 1 complete. Prove the concept works. Now we build toward sustainability. More performances, more events, more evidence that this place serves purposes beyond my personal needs. Over the following months, that's exactly what they did. The successful performance generated interest from other artists seeking unconventional venues. Sarah booked a series of events carefully spaced to avoid overwhelming the space's still limited infrastructure. Acoustic music performances, poetry readings, visual art installations, community gatherings for neighborhood organizations that had nowhere else to meet. Each event generated modest income through admission or donations, money that Sarah documented meticulously while supplementing with carefully managed gold sales. The financial model looked increasingly legitimate, a restored historic venue operating on a combination of earned income, donations, and grant funding, gradually building towards self-sufficiency. She established a nonprofit organization to formalize the barge's operations, creating legal structure that protected personal assets while providing tax advantages. The paperwork was complex, requiring consultation with attorneys who specialize in arts organizations. But the result was protection against liability and enhanced credibility with funders. Lily continued thriving in ways that surprised even Sarah. Her art had evolved beyond simple documentation into something more sophisticated. Portraits that captured psychological depth, landscapes that conveyed emotional resonance, abstracts that communicated feelings words would have struggled to express. Teachers recognized her talent, connecting her with programs for gifted students that provided instruction beyond what standard curriculum offered. She made close friends, 2 girls from her class who valued her quiet presence and learned to communicate through the alternative languages Lily had developed. They spent hours on the barge, exploring the structure's remaining unrestored sections, creating elaborate drawings that mapped their shared imaginary worlds, building friendship through collaboration rather than constant conversation. Sarah watched her daughter's social development with relief that bordered on disbelief. Lily might never speak again. The trauma that had taken her voice showed no signs of releasing its hold. But she'd proven that silence didn't mean isolation, that communication transcended speech, that she could build meaningful connections despite the barrier everyone else saw as insurmountable. Gloria had become family in ways none of them had explicitly acknowledged, but all understood. She'd moved from the manager's office to a larger space on the second level that Sarah had helped restore into a proper apartment. Small but complete, with privacy and comfort that marked the difference between squatting and residing. She'd contributed to restoration work, not through money, but through knowledge and labor. Her 6 years of solo survival in the barge translating to expertise that contractors consulted when period-appropriate techniques weren't documented. The 3 of them formed a household that existed outside conventional definitions. Not nuclear family, not formal guardianship arrangement, not landlord and tenant, but something more fundamental. People who'd found each other through desperation and created stability through mutual commitment to survival that had evolved into something approaching flourishing. By the time autumn arrived again, marking 1 full year since Sarah had first opened the vault, the transformation was undeniable. The Opera Barge had hosted 37 public events, generated $72,000 in earned income and donations, secured an additional $60,000 in grant funding, and established itself as a recognized cultural asset rather than abandoned liability. Sarah had converted approximately $180,000 worth of maize gold into accessible funds, spacing transactions carefully across multiple dealers and never raising red flags that might trigger investigation. The remaining wealth in the vault, still substantially more than she'd liquidated, represented security against future needs and the possibility of completing restoration work that would transform the barge into something fully functional rather than marginally sufficient. She'd paid accumulated property taxes, made required filings for the nonprofit organization, employed an accountant to manage books that would withstand external audit, and created documentation that presented her financial situation as careful management of modest resources rather than access to hidden fortune. The anniversary passed without ceremony. Sarah had no desire to call attention to how much time had elapsed or how dramatically circumstances had changed. But privately, standing on the restored stage while evening light filled the chamber with colors that made even damaged sections look beautiful, she acknowledged what they'd accomplished. They'd survived. More than survived, they'd built something sustainable from components that shouldn't have fit together. An abandoned barge, a hidden fortune, a selective mute daughter, a homeless woman who'd claimed shelter where none was offered. These elements had assembled into stability that felt increasingly permanent, even as Sarah remained cautious about trusting permanence. Lily joined her on the stage, no longer the traumatized 8-year-old who'd arrived terrified and silent, but a confident 9-year-old who'd learned that silence could be strength rather than deficit. She leaned against Sarah with comfortable affection, both of them looking at the seating that had held so many audiences, the walls that had witnessed so much transformation, the space that had evolved from ruin to refuge to something approaching home. "Your great-grandmother was smart," Sarah said quietly, knowing Lily would read her lips in the dimming light. She understood that wealth hidden carefully could save someone later. She couldn't have known it would be us, but she prepared for the possibility, made sure that if someone finally found what she'd left, they'd have tools for building something better. Lily nodded, then pulled out her notebook and drew one final image for the day. She drew the barge as it had been in the old photograph Sarah had found. Ornate, intact, floating level in the water, surrounded by crowds suggesting performance nights when the Empress had been vital rather than forgotten. Beside this image, she drew the barge as it existed now, partially restored, clearly marked by time and damage, but undeniably alive, smoke rising from the functional heating system, lights glowing through repaired windows. Between the two images, she drew a key. Not the physical key that had opened the vault, but a symbolic representation of access, of discovery, of the moment when hidden resources became available to someone who needed them desperately enough to ask the right questions and look in the right places. Sarah understood the drawing's message. The past and present connected through keys that unlocked more than vaults. They unlocked possibility. They transformed abandonment into opportunity. They proved that sometimes what looked like worthless garbage actually contained everything necessary for survival and transformation. Gloria appeared with mugs of tea she'd prepared in the small kitchen that had been restored enough to function properly. She handed them each a cup and settled beside them on the stage, the three of them sitting in comfortable silence while darkness completed its claim on the day. "What's next?" Gloria asked eventually. "We've stabilized the present. What does the future look like?" Sarah sipped her tea, considering the question carefully. Phase 2 restoration, completing the work on remaining sections, addressing systems that are functional but marginal, building toward the point where we're not constantly managing crises, but actually operating sustainably. More events, more diverse programming, establishing the barge as essential rather than experimental. She paused, thinking about the vault that still held millions in unrealized wealth, and gradually converting remaining assets, carefully enough not to trigger problems, but steadily enough to fund the completion of restoration. May left us enough to finish what we started. We just need to be patient and careful about accessing it. Lily drew in her notebook, adding to the images she'd created. She drew the three of them, sitting on the stage exactly as they were now. Above their heads, she drew a roof that was complete rather than patched. Around them, she drew walls that showed full restoration. Beneath them, she drew a hole that sat perfectly level in water that looked clean rather than contaminated. The drawing represented the future they were building toward. Not perfect, not erasing evidence of damage and struggle, but complete, functional, sustainable, transformed through patient work from what it had been into what it was capable of becoming. Then that's what we do, Gloria said simply. We keep building, keep converting resources carefully, keep proving that this place matters, keep surviving until survival turns into something more certain. They sat together as night settled completely, the opera barge rocking gently beneath them with the river's patient movement. Above, through the fully repaired sections of roof, stars were becoming visible in clear sky. Inside, the restored chamber held warmth from the heating system that actually worked, light from electrical systems that met modern codes, and three people who'd found each other through circumstances that should have destroyed them, but instead had created family. The vault beneath the stage remained secured, holding wealth that would continue funding their transformation for years to come. The key that had opened it lived in Sarah's pocket, carried always as a reminder of the moment when hidden resources had become available exactly when needed most. And on the stage where performers had once commanded audiences through voices amplified by architecture designed for sound, a silent 9-year-old girl sat beside the mother who'd refused to give up and the woman who'd survived alone long enough to recognize salvation when it finally arrived. They'd inherited an abandoned dream and transformed it through necessity, creativity, and stubborn determination into something that deserved continuation. The opera barge was no longer a ruin. It was a functioning venue, a historic landmark, a community resource, and a home for people who needed one desperately enough to build it from components everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Chen's $600 gamble had been vindicated across 3 decades of patience. Her hidden fortune had saved exactly the people she'd hoped to protect, even though she'd never known their names or imagined their specific circumstances. She'd understood only that wealth carefully preserved and strategically hidden could provide rescue to someone who needed it someday, when fate aligned discovery with desperation. That someday had arrived. The rescue had succeeded, and now the work of transformation continued, built on foundations that combined abandonment with opportunity, trauma with resilience, silence with communication that transcended speech. The river continued its ancient movement beneath them, patient and indifferent, carrying water toward destinations it would reach with or without human understanding of meaning or purpose. But inside the structure floating on that water, meaning had been created through intention, purpose had been claimed through necessity, and 3 survivors had proven that sometimes the best inheritances came wrapped in abandonment, waiting for exactly the right people to recognize worth that simply needed rediscovery rather than creation. The light stayed on. The heat kept them warm. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build on what they'd already accomplished, converting hidden wealth into visible transformation, proving day by day that May's carefully protected fortune hadn't just saved them. It had given them tools to save themselves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.